checking you can see my screen okay. Okay, I'm getting some nods, we'll go with that. So look, thanks for joining me for the next 20 minutes or so to really focus in on, I was going to say go deep, but in 20 minutes, we're not going to go that deep, but focus in on the neuroscience of creativity. And as Joe's mentioned, you know, I started getting really curious about how it was that our brains worked when we were creating ideas. And that curiosity came from being a creativity practitioner. It led me to embark on a program of master's study. And I bought the book, The Neuroscience of Creativity, which I thoroughly recommend. And started on a journey to better understand what neuroscience really meant for creativity. And that journey's taken me to a place where I'm in the final throes of finalizing a piece of work on creative cognition and breakthrough ideas. And it's seen me explore 5 different yet overlapping lenses. One is the dual process model of creativity and the fact that we're using both the spontaneous and attention control networks in our brain. And so that has implications for metacognition and the creative process. The second lens was concentrated on activating creative drive and the role of motivation. The third was exploring shifting perspective to gain insight. And the fourth, deploying defocused attention, which is a super interesting area and one I hope we have the chance to talk a bit about today. And finally, sparking remote connections. So look, the focus here is obviously divergent thinking and with a focus on ideation, simply because I had to draw a line in the sand somewhere. But I think what's really, really interesting about this is sparking remote connections might be the point where most people want to start and crack on. But actually, to do a really good job of that, we've got to be a whole lot smarter and a whole lot more integrated in our approach, which many people talk about, but in my experience, perhaps not so many deliver on. So with that in mind, I then wanted to explore some of the thinking from leading thinkers in the field. And I got in touch with 4 of the authors out of the Neuroscience of Creativity book, who I was particularly interested in, along with a couple of others. So I've spoken with Dr. Alice Flaherty on creative drive, who is a neurologist. I was Dr. Yoed Kennett, who focuses in on associative thinking. Dr. Liang Gabora, who looks at divergent thinking and context. And Matthias Benedict, who focuses on many, many things, one of which is internally directed attention. And I also engaged with Fred Valle-Torrejo, who looks at insight and incubation, and Ken Gulhorley, who also looks at incubation. And so I've had some really, really interesting conversations. The conversation with Ken actually is not until next week. So this has led me to put together a bundle of learnings. And look, I'll talk about some of the work from the thought leaders I've mentioned, and any misrepresentations of their work, I profoundly give my apologies for. I'm attempting to avoid that. Let's hope that's the case. So look, my question for you is, because 20 minutes is, as I've said, you know, it's not the sort of time we're going to do a deep dive in. I would love to hear what people are most passionate about. And to do that, why don't we give everybody 3 votes, because we'll have time to talk about 3 of these. And the 5 that you get to choose from, and I'll come off screen share for a minute so I can see everyone, and we'll do a show of hands. The first, and all I'm going to give you, by the way, is the title. So you've got to vote based on the title. So the very first, you can be too motivated. The second, the aha myth. The third, are you really thinking divergently? The fourth is the extraordinary result of an ordinary process. And the fifth is around semantic memory, structure, and search. So think about the three that you're most interested in, and we'll come on to screen share for our highly scientific voting process. So if you've got your camera on, you get a vote is the good news. Anyone else, if you're feeling a little shy, you're welcome to pop it in chat, and if we get the chance, we'll look at it. Okay, so let's take our vote. How many people for you can be too motivated? Okay, so it looks like we've got 3 for we can be 2. We've got 4, I think that might have been even. Okay, the aha myth. Any excitement for that? Okay, 1 for aha. Hi, Hannah, nice to see you. 2 for aha. Okay, amazing. So 3, are you really thinking divergently? 1 vote, 2 votes, 3, 4, maybe about 5, and someone drinking a glass of water will give that a half vote. Okay, 4th is the extraordinary result of an ordinary process. Any votes for that? I've got 1, 2, I think I've got 2. We'll go with 2 for that. 3, okay, maybe 4, we'll say 4. And finally, semantic memory, structure, and search. I can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, possibly even 8. Okay, so I think where we net out on that is we're going to take a look at, definitely take a look at semantic memory, structure, and search. We're going to take a look at, are you really thinking divergently? And we're also going to take a look at, got a bit of a tiebreaker. We'll go for the extraordinary result of an ordinary process. Okay, so let's take a look. So the thinking on this topic of, are we really thinking divergently, comes from a conversation with Dr. Leanne Gabora. And Leanne was originally a computational biologist, and she started exploring cultural evolution. And she thought, well, look, I'll do some reading on creativity for sort of 2 or 3 months. And she said that was 20 years ago. And she fell in love with the field of creativity. And, you know, the start point in our conversation is really around the context of divergent thinking. And what she says is this, and Leanne develops the honing theory of creativity. And just to call out, I've got a collection of references at the end of the document for anyone who's interested in further reading or watching. I'll pass those on to you. So the honing theory of creativity says, despite a common misconception that when we're thinking divergently, we're actually, and you'll see this in the top part of the figure, the round circle, the misconception is that we're thinking really, really broadly, but actually in reality, what's happening is on the second level. And that what is happening there is that we are accessing our memory in slivers, and those slivers are defined by the context. But what's interesting, and you'll see this with the picture bottom left and bottom right, is that regardless of the context, we're actually seeking to hone one idea. We're just accessing it from different angles. And so Leanne's thinking is, hence it's called the honing theory of creativity, that we have in our minds, often beyond the grasp of conscious perception, this idea or this thing that we're struggling or trying very hard to articulate. And I think why that's interesting for us to consider in the creative problem solving process is that we want to, as quickly as possible, gosh, it's a bit like being in a train station here, isn't it? We've got people coming and going. What's really, really important for us is that we're rendering our ideas as quickly as possible because this is an iterative process. Each time we're able to render the idea, we're then able to critique it and get a little closer, refine it, get a little bit closer to what is the thing that we're actually trying to articulate. And so Leanne's thinking, when we started discussing, okay, so what's new, what's she really passionate about that she's working on right now? And we started talking about the transformations that occur in the garden of our minds. I quite like that phrase, the garden of our minds, where we create the right conditions for new ideas to grow. And she said, when you look to biology, what's really interesting about the outputs of a process, often the outputs are excrement. But what's really, really important is the transformational nature of the process. And Leanne was saying, you know, that's food for thought for us in creativity. We can sometimes become quite focused on the outputs and not pay enough attention, if you like, to the transformative process that's going on. So why does it matter? Well, certainly what I've taken out of that, I think the psychological entropy that occurs when we are grasping or moving toward articulating this idea creates a tension, a creative tension in the process. And of course, that's something that we want to really capitalize on and leverage in the creative climate. The second point I think that it really highlights for us is the importance of rendering an iteration. And look, that's no surprise to those of us who are using hybrid approaches that include lean startup thinking, where iteration and test and learn is a really natural and intuitive part of the process. And finally, what it highlights, you know, if we weren't clear on it already, and I suspect we all were, but never harmful to reflect on it, is the value of diverse perspectives. Because if we're all, each of us, honing an idea, many heads in that case are better than one, because we're all bringing different ideas to the conversation. So that's the thinking on, are we really thinking divergently? And look, for a lot of people, as it did for me, it brings to mind, I think it's an article by Yorick and Runco talking about divergent thinking and that real challenge. When we say we're thinking divergently, let's make sure we really, really are, and that we're exploring many different directions, not just playing around in one area. So I think some really good reminders. So next I spoke with Matthias Benedict, who works in attention control. He does a lot of work in memory and cognitive control. And the start point there, bottom left, is that Matthias talks about how 25 to 50% of our time is not spent in focused attention. It's spent in what's referred to as leaky or broad attention, where we're scanning the environment really, really broadly. We're maybe daydreaming, we're maybe mind wandering. And, you know, instantly, I think the implication of that is for us, we want to get a whole lot more interested about how we can really productively use that time in the creative process, not ignore it, not hope that it might come to something good, but actually use it quite purposefully. And the other thing I'm really interested in as part of that is the importance of internally directed attention. And look, I suspect all of us, but definitely me at times, have over-relied on group ideation as part of the creative problem-solving process. And I think there's a real challenge there to dial up the amount of individual ideation that's occurring. And I think what's interesting about that is when you do then go back to Osborne, for example, and applied imagination, in that he says very, very clearly that group brainstorming, and brainstorming, of course, is only one example of an ideation technique, that group ideation techniques are only intended to work alongside individual ideation. And, you know, I think that's something perhaps a lot of folk have really lost sight of. So I think there were some really great reminders in there. So in terms of what's new, there's an article that's been put out recently, and by recently I mean I think last week, in Nature by Matthias Benedict, BT, Schachter and Kennett, that looks at the role of memory in idea creation. And I particularly liked this figure and just want to mention it briefly. The y-axis, just in case it's a little hard to read, at the very bottom is associative processes, at the very top it's control processes. And on the left, we've got semantic memory. On the right, we've got episodic memory. And what they map out in this article is really, I think, the evolution of thinking from Mednick's 1962 associative theory of creativity, where he said, look, creativity is essentially about making remote associations using associative processes, using our semantic memory, and therefore the structure of that memory is really important. Now, as I've already mentioned, the dual process model of creativity says, hey, wait a minute, this is not just about associative processes and the spontaneous network in our brains, or our spontaneous brain network rather, it's also about our attention control network. And when you look at some of that research, a lot of which has really only come to fruition and come out sort of in the last 10 years, what it says is it's not as simple as saying, well, okay, divergent thinking must be about the associative bit, convergent thinking must be about the attention control bit, because actually what the research shows that both brain networks are used in divergent thinking and convergent thinking. And so, you know, that really helps shatter a lot of myths about creativity. And I think the other really important thing about this figure is it's telling us that not only is semantic memory, so abstract concepts, not only is semantic memory important, but also our episodic memory. So whether we're drawing on experiences from the past or even projecting or simulating in the future. And whilst this looks like a really simple diagram, actually it is huge because it shatters a lot of the myths about the type of memory we're using and the brain networks we're using. So why it matters, in summary, I know I've pulled these things out already, it means that broad and leaky attention, there's more we can do there, I think, quite proactively. It means that internally directed attention needs more attention, if you'll excuse the pun, paid to it. And it also means, I think, there's more for us to do around episodic memory than perhaps some of the current ideation tools currently support. So finally, we'll close with semantic memory structure and search. In this conversation, I was speaking with Yoed Kennett, who does a lot of work in the area of knowledge and memory structure using network science. And a couple of the critical building blocks that he maps out are around our memory, also around our flexibility, and he splits memory into the structure and into the search processes and looks at using network mapping, how highly creative people are a lot more flexible, a lot more connected, have a lot more connections, are faster to make connections. And some of these things were obviously mapped out in the associative theory of creativity, but have not been empirically proven until quite recently. And that's quite exciting, or certainly I think it is. And I think the second dimension of this is then search processes and how our search processes work when we're free associating. And again, what this shows, and if you're interested, you know, definitely jump into the list of readings. You'll be able to see the diagrams in glorious Technicolor and at a much larger size. What it tells us, though, is that highly creative people, and again, empirically proves, are making much more remote associations. So a couple of final thoughts here. Yoed Kennett has gone on to really explore thirst for knowledge and is looking at curiosity, creativity, and aesthetics, and curiosity as a drive for information search and the dopamine rewards that really underpin that and fuel it. So why does this matter? It means there's a role here for us potentially to feed and augment people's memories so they do have more broad observations to call on, a role, I think, for creative stimulus. I think there's a second angle here around stimulating broader search processes and working hard, particularly to find tools when we know we might be working with people for whom ideation is not a regular part of their working life. And finally, I think the search for information and the curiosity that underpins that and the reward mechanisms mean we need to do a good job of dialing up rewards in the process. And I'm not meaning goodie bags or infantile sort of, things that would appeal to 5-year-olds, but really being smart about a sense of progress in the creative problem solving process and reinforcing that we're making progress toward meaningful work. So guys, that's a snapshot of some of the thinking, as I've said, work in progress that I've been doing in the area of creative cognition and what it means to getting to breakthrough ideas. I hope you found that useful. I'll pass you back to Jo.
Okay, thank you so much, Coral. Very interesting. And I'm sure everybody found it so, and I'm going to stop the recording here and you can start asking questions while we get ready for the next presenters. You can ask a couple of questions.